Okay. Well, thank you, you guys, for being here today for our expert series talk. Today we're going to have Seth Jones. So he is a fish and wildlife biologist working for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services Ecology Services branch at the North Dakota Field Office as an employee for Ecological Services. He works to conserve federally endangered and threatened species and their habitats. His main role with the North Dakota Field Office are implementing the Endangered Species Act, especially as it pertains to energy productions, and serving as the office leads for the Western Prairie Fringed Orchids. He's originally from Wisconsin and attended North Dakota State University for his undergraduate degree. He spent a few years working in South America in Oregon before deciding to pursue his master's. He completed his master's in science and natural resources management at North Dakota State University in 2021, where he studied wetland conditions and plant communities in the Prairie Pothole regions. While his career routine has taken him away from the research field, he's hoping to use the knowledge acquired from his previous research to better his abilities to carry out ecology services missions of conservation and research, and recovery of threatened and endangered species. So with that, I will give the speaker over to you, Seth.
All right, thanks. I'll just share my screen here quick. All right. You guys all see that fine?
Yes, sir.
All right. Well, thank you for that introduction, Anita, and thank you for inviting me to talk on this series. I really appreciate it. I've been looking forward to it. And thanks to everybody for attending and listening to this. Hopefully I can teach you guys a little bit about the research that I was doing at NDSU while I was there for my master's. So like Anita said, I'm currently a fish and wildlife biologist for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, but I did my master's research at NDSU in Fargo, North Dakota, and particularly we looked at wetland conditions and plant communities. Today, I'm going to be going over part of that master's research that I did while I was there on the influence that invasive species play on plant community composition in Prairie Pothole Region wetlands. So just right away, first getting into the study objectives. So the first thing that we wanted to do with this research, it was funded by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and we wanted to provide some insight into what the current plant community composition of some of their wetlands looked like on U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service fee title lands. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, especially over here in the Prairie Pothole region, they manage a lot of land area. I'm sure everybody is familiar with fee title lands to some extent, probably more familiar with the National Wildlife Refuges. But over here, we also have a lot of waterfall production areas, or WPAs, as we often refer to them as. And there's just a lot of land that they manage here, and they don't really have the staff or the resources to go out and do these in-depth inventories of what's actually going on those lands, see what species are actually there. So that was part of the reason we did this. We wanted to look at those wetlands, give them a better understanding of what the plant communities looked like on these lands. Next, we really wanted to determine, what was influencing those prairie pothole wetland plant communities. What were the trends that we were seeing? What was really driving what we were seeing with that plant community composition, whether it be anthropogenic factors, climate, invasive species. We weren't really sure going into it, so that's why we wanted to look at it. And then lastly, we also just want to provide them with a base of information to help assist with their future management plans. For example, they did some research similar to this back in the early to mid 2000s on their uplands, so their prairie areas. They were looking at plant community composition of those prairies and looking at invasive species cover of those prairies. And starting out with that basis of information, they're able to move forward and create what is now known as their Native Prairie Adaptive Management Plan. That plan looks at fire, grazing, rest periods, and how different frequencies of that can affect the plant communities, ultimately creating more biodiversity on the landscape and reducing invasive species cover. So that's what we were kind of hoping for out of this, is this data would provide that base that they could use to start creating a management plan like that. I'm not sure how familiar everybody is with the Prairie Pothole region. Just gonna assume people aren't extremely familiar with it or the wetlands that we have here. So I'll get into a little bit of a detail on it. First off, you can see the outline. This is more so just a rough outline of the Prairie Pothole region here. It's a very large area. It covers a lot of Canada, covers quite a few different states, Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, parts of Minnesota, and all the way down into Iowa even. It's approximately 800,000 square kilometers. So like I said, very large area, very unique characteristics. And it started forming roughly 12,000 years ago after the last glacial retreat. What happened there is glacial ice left behind, incorporated with glacial till, melted, and that formed many of these closed depressions that ultimately turned into the wetlands. They had low permeability soil. We get a lot of snow melt here in the area. We get some rain and everything too. And the low permeability soil in those depressions, coupled with those conditions, formed wetlands eventually. And of those wetlands that we have here, the most common are palustrine emergent wetlands. Pretty much everything that would be considered a prairie pothole here in the region would be a palustrine emergent wetland. And then we break those wetlands down into classifications. That's generally how we talk about them here. So you have anything from your ephemeral wetlands, which technically aren't actually considered wetlands, all the way up to your permanently ponded wetlands. And for this study, we focused on temporary and seasonal wetlands. So temporary wetlands are wetlands that, here they have 2 vegetation zones. They generally are not ponded for very long. Like I said, after that snow melts, they'll retain water for several weeks, sometimes well into the spring. And after heavy rainfall events, you'll see water in them for several days, usually pretty small. Some of the ones that I looked at were only a few meters across, all the way up to about an acre were the larger end of them. Seasonal wetlands, they have 3 vegetation zones, and they tend to hold water a lot longer. Sometimes they still only hold water into the spring. Sometimes it's well into the summer. I've seen other ones that hold it all the way into the fall even. And sometimes that water is as deep as 3 meters. Sometimes, especially in drought years, they're completely dry even for a majority of the year. But overall, they have unique characteristics about them. And one of the main reasons we focused on these 2 wetland types, for one, they are the most numerous wetlands in the region. They make up a majority of the wetlands that we have here in the Prairie Pothole region. But also they're known to be the most susceptible to disturbance, particularly anthropogenic disturbance. So they're often cultivated, they're often drained, they're very susceptible to climate change as well. And in fact, it's been estimated up to 90% of these temporary and seasonal wetlands have been lost due to anthropogenic disturbance. So just looking at the land management a little bit, particularly of these fee title lands that I was talking about, this is a pretty common landscape that we have here in the Prairie Pothole region. You'll see, some native grasslands, some pasture land, some crop production, all mixed together with these potholes littering the landscape. That's a pretty common sight here. And then the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, they manage a lot of these lands. It's actually a pretty significant portion of the public lands that we have here in the Prairie Pothole region are these fee title lands, these national wildlife refuges or waterfowl production areas. One interesting fact for you guys that maybe you don't know is, so the state that actually has the most national wildlife refuges out of any of the states in the US, a lot of people would guess California or maybe Florida, something like that. But the state with the most national wildlife refuges is actually North Dakota. So we have quite a bit of fee title land here in the northern Great Plains. So the way a lot of this land looks today varies quite a bit. Some of this land was acquired as native prairie. Other land, and probably a majority of these WPAs, especially when they were acquired or previously, at least at some point in time, they were cultivated and had to be reseeded back into perennial grassland. Sometimes it was the previous owner that reseeded it into grassland. Sometimes it was the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service after they acquired it. And these acquisitions have been going on back all the way into the 1930s and 40s. So we've had some of these lands for quite a while. And then the early management of these lands, whether it's by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or the previous owner, it often included, even when they're doing that reseeding mixture, there's a lot of introduced species in there, or they were not doing the best management practices, like they were leaving the lands idle for long periods of time. But they've updated their management goals. Now they're focusing a lot more on biodiversity and ecological integrity. But even still today, a lot of these lands do not appear to be good condition native prairie. A big reason for that, like I said, was because they were reseeded with introduced species. They didn't have the best management early on, but also even the ones that are acquired and have better management today, a lot of them are really small parcels. I guess small is a relative size, but they'll be like 640 acres, just one section on the landscape, and they'll be completely surrounded by agriculture, or they'll be more checkerboarded like this photo that I had just showed you guys. That plays a large part into what these lands actually look like as well, and what resources can be used on the lands. So now getting into the plant community composition. So just looking at differences between our native and reseeded wetlands. I'll say reseeded wetlands, but what I actually mean is wetlands that are on reseeded grassland, because whether it was the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or whoever owned it before, a lot of the wetlands weren't actually reseeded when these lands were acquired. It was just the upland portions of these lands that were reseeded, and the wetlands had to rely on other forms of colonization like the seed bank or other means of dispersal in order to get the plant species that you see there today. But generally, the wetlands in the native prairie and on these reseeded lands do not seem to look similar. They do not seem to have the same diversity in plant species communities. The native prairie wetlands have a lot higher species richness, whereas the restored wetlands have a lot higher abundance of invasive species or just introduced species overall. And then often that higher abundance of invasive species leads to a reduction in native diversity and cover on those lands. So now actually looking at the study that we did, looking at our study area. So you can see here another depiction of the Prairie Pothole region, but now looking more specifically at North and South Dakota. You can see the outline of the Prairie Pothole region again. And then you can see all 200 of our wetland sites that we visited, whether it's in 2020 or 2021, we did 100 each year. You can see they're spread out across the landscape to try to get a pretty broad and region-wide understanding of these plant communities and the wetland conditions. And then I also like to point out, so the purple shaded areas, those are those fee title lands that I'm talking about. So the larger ones that you can see there are likely some of the national wildlife refuges where it might be a little bit harder to see, but a lot of those smaller purple dots are those little WPAs that I was talking about that are kind of checkerboarded on the landscape. So for the study design was done before I came on to do this research. So I might not be the best resource to actually talk about how they chose these sites. There are a couple publications out there that do a lot better job of explaining it than me, but just the main point is we had 250 different sites in this study design. 100 of those were seasonal wetlands, 100 were temporary wetlands, and then we had 50 oversample wetlands. And those oversample wetlands were only to be used if those primary seasonal or temporary wetlands were deemed unusable for the study. So some of the reasons why they might have been deemed unusable, they could have been completely surrounded by private land, so we had no access to them. They were classified seasonal or temporary by the National Wetlands Inventory, and we all know that that's not perfect. So it might say it's a temporary wetland, but we went out there and we looked and there's actually no wetland there at all. So we weren't going to use that for our study. And sometimes it went the other way. It might have said it was a seasonal wetland, but we went out there and it was very clearly more permanently ponded than those seasonal wetlands. And then, like I said, it was 100 of each that we were supposed to be doing, but we decided that the wetland classification would ultimately come down to what you decided it should be classified as out in the field. And we classified that using the number of vegetation zones that were present. So our seasonal wetlands have 3 vegetation zones, where our temporary wetlands only had 2 vegetation zones. So that's primarily what we used just for time's sake to determine what classification these were. And that resulted in 141 seasonal and 59 temporary rather than 100 of each. And then to actually look at our plant communities, we use the Index of Plant Community Integrity, which is a plant species-based IBI that was designed for the Prairie Pothole Region, wetlands here in the Prairie Pothole Region. And it looks at a bunch of different factors, such as species biodiversity, coefficient of conservatism scores, percentage of species present that are introduced, just different plant community traits. And it scores these wetlands for a wetland condition ranking. And that was the other part of my research. I won't get too much into that. If you have any questions about these wetland conditions in the region, I'm happy to talk about it afterwards, but I'll move on from that for now. The main reason we use this method for the plant communities, though, is because it had a quadrat method that you use to collect primary species cover data, and that could be used in the analysis that we wanted to do. So we had these primary species that were inside of the quadrats, but then there were also secondary species that were recorded outside of the quadrat. So these secondary species, we did not estimate cover for these species. We just recorded them when they were between but not within the quadrats that we placed. And that would be used for the IPCI scoring, as well as looking at how frequently these species occurred on the landscape. We wanted to see if our study, especially on such a large regional scale, would line up with what we were seeing in previous studies showing that reseeded and native prairie wetlands were different. So we use multi-response permutation procedure to do that. And then to actually do the analysis of the species cover data, we use non-metric multidimensional scaling. And with that, we're looking for trends, we're looking for patterns in the species composition that would ultimately help us determine what was influencing the plant communities or what those drivers would be. And for that, we separated out the plant communities by both wetland classification and vegetation zone. So an example of that would be our wet meadow zone of our temporary wetlands, or shallow marsh zone of our seasonal wetlands. And then looking at that and our IPCI quadrat method in general, just to give you guys an image of what that would look like. So for our seasonal wetlands, we have those 3 zones. We have the low prairie, wet meadow, and shallow marsh. Temporary wetlands just has a low prairie and a wet meadow. The low prairie, we placed evenly placed 8 quadrats around the low prairie, tried to center them within the low prairie. The wet meadow, there would be 7 quadrats, and then the shallow marsh would get 5. And then in the central zone for each of these wetlands, we would try to do the quadrats in more of a spiraling fashion, starting at the outer edge and then working our way to the center, just to try to get the best grasp on what the plant communities actually looked like in those zones. All right, so getting into the results now. So this just looking at species frequently, our most common species that we are seeing on the landscape in these wetlands. So for the entirety of the study, we identified, I believe, 348 different species. These 25 species here are the only ones that were found in at least 50% of the wetlands that we went to. So not many of the species were found frequently throughout the study. Most of them were found at just a few of the wetlands. But one thing I'd really like to point out with this, looking at the 4 most commonly occurring species were all introduced species. So that was our Canada thistle, Kentucky bluegrass, smooth brome, and field sow thistle. All 4 of those species occurred at least 90% of the wetlands that we visited. And 2 species in particular, our Kentucky bluegrass and Canada thistle, were at every single wetland site that we went to. So all 200 sites we visited, we found these, whether it was high cover dominant species there, or whether it was just a few individuals there, they were present at every single wetland that we went to. So just looking at our native versus reseeded, that MRPP, we found that basically all the plant communities were significantly different when looking at our native versus our reseeded wetlands. The only one that wasn't different was the low prairie of temporary wetlands. And looking at just a little bit of a comparison for those to give you guys a visual of what these plant communities looked like a little bit, and why this one might not have been significantly different. So looking at our dominant species that we had at these wetlands, our other introduced species, our native graminoids, native forbs, and then our native trees and shrubs. You can see all the way across there, there's not anything that really pops out as being that different from one another when looking at these different aspects of the plant communities. The biggest one is probably the average cover of smooth brome for the reseeded versus the native. But even in the native prairie wetlands in that low prairie area, there was still over a 30% average relative cover of smooth brome. So it was still high regardless. So now when we look at one that was significantly different, like our temporary wet meadow zone, you can see it's pretty obvious why these were different. The dominant invasive species here would be reed canary grass, really high cover in our reseeded wetlands, very low cover in our native prairie wetlands, where our native graminoids had the exact opposite, with the lower cover in the reseeded wetlands and very high cover in native prairie wetlands. And then just showing you guys, looking at our seasonal wetlands now. Surprisingly, this one, even though it was significantly different, it does not look that different when you compare it in this way. The most obvious difference here is there's over 20% cover of other introduced species like our Canada thistle and field sow thistle, and only about 10% for our native prairie, low prairie areas. So that was the biggest difference there. Otherwise, even though it was significantly different, we weren't seeing that much of a difference between the 2 wetland types. Again, seasonal wet meadow looks pretty similar to last time. Pretty obvious differences in those relative covers when looking at the reed canary grass and the native graminoids. And for our shallow marsh, the dominant species was hybrid cattail. Again, pretty clear and obvious difference with that and some of our other species when comparing native and reseeded. Okay, so getting into our non-metric multidimensional scaling results, not sure how familiar people are with this method, but basically it's used to look for patterns among species. You use cover of species, so species cover data sets, and it looks for patterns, relationships, trends among these species to explain variance that's going on in the data set. So that variance is explained by these different axes, and it produces these axes to cumulatively explain a high percentage of the variance that's going on in the data set, but each axis explains its own percentage of the variance that's going on in the data set. So every single plant community that we tested ended up with 3 axes to explain the variance, and every single circumstance, axis 1 explained the most, followed by axis 2, and axis 3 explained the least. And then the species cover data set is correlated to these axes. So each species gets a correlation coefficient with these axes. In order for it to be considered significantly correlated with the axis, it has to have a Pearson correlation coefficient of 0.4 or greater. That's the absolute value. So the closer that absolute value is to 1, the higher the correlation of that species is with that axis. The closer it is to 0, the lower the correlation with the axis. That's basically how this data works. And so these were all of the species that were significantly correlated with at least one of the axes for the low prairie or wet meadow of temporary wetlands. Now, I won't get into all of these different species. I just want to point 2 out in particular, and that is our smooth brome and our reed canary grass. Smooth brome had a really high correlation, nearly a -1 correlation with the low prairie, with axis 1 of the low prairie. So that axis that explains the most amount of variation within that data set is ultimately appears to be being controlled by the cover of smooth brome that's there. And then we see the same thing with the wet meadow, except with reed canary grass, really high correlation. So it means that's primarily responsible for explaining what's going on within the variance on that axis and what's going on in the plant community. Just giving you guys a visual representation of what those axes look like. So this is smooth brome with the low prairie of temporary wetlands. So we have our symbols here. We have axis 1 there along the bottom. We have the symbols. Each of those symbols in that central graph represents a wetland site. And then the size of the symbol reflects the relative abundance of that species at that site. So you can see it's pretty obvious on the left hand of this axis. We have our sites with much higher abundance of smooth brome. The right end of the axis, much lower abundance of smooth brome. Even more obvious when you look at this one, this is reed canary grass with the wet meadow, a very clear trend going on there. A very high correlation with axis 1 for relative cover of reed canary grass. All right, so now looking at our seasonal wetlands, I won't go through it all again. I just want to point out the main species, the main things that we're seeing and taking away from this, and that is those dominant invasive species. Again, they have very high correlations with axis 1. Again, axis 1 is explaining the most variation in these data sets. So it appears like the cover of these species is driving a lot of the variation that's going on within these data sets. And to the extent, one other one I like to point out is below smooth brome there, you can see Elymus repens or quackgrass is significantly correlated with axis 1 there as well. Well, quackgrass is another introduced or invasive species that we have here in the region. And it's positively correlated with the axis, where smooth brome is negatively correlated with the axis. And what we're taking away from this is that Smooth brome is reducing the cover even of the other dominant invasive species that we have here. It's become so dominant that its presence means all other species, regardless of whether they're introduced or native, are likely to not be there in high abundance. And if I showed you all of the species correlations, not just the significant correlations, you'd see that even more clearly, because you'd see just smooth brome on one side, and then everything else would be right around zero, or it would be on the positive side of that axis. Just showing you those graphs again for these three species now. Again, very clear and obvious trend why it's so highly correlated with axis 1 there. All right, so what are we taking away from this? What are our conclusions? Well, first off, like I said, the most commonly found species, unfortunately, in our area are appearing to be some introduced species, and not only introduced species, but species that are often thought of as invasive. And those 4 species, again, are Canada thistle, our Kentucky bluegrass, smooth brome, and our field sow thistle. And then the only native species which we were seeing occurring very frequently on the landscape were usually species that are known to be able to handle or tolerate higher levels of disturbance. So whether that's soil disturbance or disturbance that's caused by these invasive species, they're the only ones that appear to be also thriving on the landscape. And possibly the most important takeaway from this part is it seems like a lot of our regional diversity is being found in a very small percentage of our wetlands surveyed. So these good condition native prairie wetlands, you know, they're harboring a lot of the diversity that we have here in the Prairie Pothole region. A lot of these poor condition wetlands that have high abundance of these invasive species do not have high species diversity, and you're seeing the same species over and over again. And then all of these infrequently occurring species were only being found at these good condition wetlands. So their importance is very obvious when you look at it in that way, that they're harboring so much of the diversity on the landscape, because you might go to one of these wetlands and it has 100 different native species at it. You might go to 100 poor condition wetlands and there's only 100 different species at those wetlands. And a lot of them are going to be introduced or invasive species. So they're very important for the region from that perspective. We did confirm for the most part that, similar to other studies, those reseeded wetland plant communities are not closely resembling the native prairie wetland plant communities. Regardless of the management that's being put in, even a lot of the wetlands that were restored or reseeded under more recent management, they're still not resembling those native prairie areas. And overall, the plant community composition drivers were not what we expected. When you're looking for those trends or those patterns with the species, you're not necessarily expecting one species to completely take over and explain that as much variance as some of these were. Generally, you're looking for, like I said, more so patterns with the species. You're looking for, a lot of previous studies that have looked at research like this have found species on one side are correlated to freshwater wetlands, where the other side, they're brackish wetlands, or one is when the shallow marsh is in drawdown condition, where the other is when it's in open water condition. Things like that is more so what we were expecting to see. We weren't expecting the invasive species to play quite as significant of a role as what they did. But that is the conclusion that we came away with, is that plant community composition of these wetlands is ultimately being driven by the abundance of invasive species. It's accounting for a lot of the variance that we're seeing within these plant communities. And that would be smooth brome for the low prairie, reed canary grass for the wet meadow, and hybrid cattail for the shallow marsh. There's been a lot of other research that has shown that these are invasive species, that they're here, they're here in great abundances, that they're a problem. A lot of this has even said that they are causing reduction in diversity, or at least correlated to reduction in diversity, things like that, but not many have gone quite as far as what we are hypothesizing, in that they're actually driving the change in plant community composition. And one of the most compelling arguments that we found for this is that these dominant invasive species appear to be showing the same influence on the plant communities, regardless of what plant community they're in and regardless of how they colonize that landscape. Like I said, some of these species, like our smooth brome, were actually planted in the uplands of many of these waterfowl production areas back before updated management tactics. So they were planted there. So a lot of people are like, well, yeah, it makes sense that these species are there in high abundance because they're planted there. They're planted there because they're so dense. They make good waterfowl habitat, but they often weren't the only species planting there. And now when you go to a lot of these areas, they're the only species really that you can see that's obviously present anymore. So they have reduced the other species that were planted along with them. And we were even seeing, some of the times when they're present at these native prairie sites as well, they were present in very high abundances too. They weren't planted there in those native prairie sites, but when they got there and when nothing was done to reduce them, they started to take over to a similar extent that they did in these reseeded areas. And same with reed canary grass and hybrid cattail. A lot of times, majority of the time, they weren't actually planted there. They got there through more natural means of dispersal and colonized more naturally. That's how they got to that landscape, but they're showing the exact same trends. It's appearing the exact same way. They're dominating the landscape the exact same way that, smooth brome is, even when it was planted there. So they're showing that same influence on the plant community regardless. There are different factors that affect whether they're there. Obviously, they're more likely to be there in more disturbed landscape. That's just a fact, but regardless, they are still driving that change within the plant communities. They're using various means of self-facilitization to just completely take over and dominate, reach relative covers near 100%. And like I said, it appears both from the data that we saw, but also from when we were out in the field, that they're out competing other invasive species as well, which might not seem like as bad of a thing, but they're reducing those those native species to an even greater extent, and that is bad for the landscape. All right, so in order to get a better understanding of what we're seeing here, and just get a better understanding of how these invasive species are affecting the plant communities and driving this change, we need to do more continual monitoring. Pretty much every single wetland site that we went to, this was the first time a plant community survey has ever been done on these wetland sites. So we need to get back out there. We need to continue looking at them, see if there's other factors that are playing a significant role as well. And we need to see, some of these new lands that they're acquiring, that they're reseeding with these diverse seed mixtures of native plant species. We need to monitor those as well, make sure that invasive species aren't getting in there. And if they are, see if they're affecting it that same way. There's a lot of different ways the research could continue going, even just with the data that we have right now. I won't get into all those ways. One of the things I think would be really interesting to look at would be to consider the drivers, do the same analysis for the reseeded and the native prairie wetlands, separately. So, because then if we're seeing the same results for both of them, when they're done separately, it helps to further prove our point here. Lastly, everybody always says this, but it's still something good to always tack on, is that management needs to prioritize invasive species control. And particularly here in our region, they need to focus on the reduction in the spread of invasive species into our native areas. Like I said, some of the times when they were in the native areas, they were starting to really take over. And that's very problematic because like I was saying in the species frequency, these native areas, these good conditioned wetlands, are what is harboring a lot of the overall diversity that we have on the landscape. So if they get in there, they take over, they drive change in these plant communities, then we're losing a lot of the diversity on the landscape, potentially even leading to more endangered species and things of that sort. And then we just need to recognize our introduced species before they become a problem, like we're seeing with the cattail, with the reed canary grass and smooth brome. There usually tends to be some signs that you can look at, and oftentimes they're ignored until it's too late. So we need to get better about reacting to that. And with that, I believe that's all I have. Are there any questions? I will stop sharing so that people can ask. Oh, I see there's a hand up.
Hello. Yeah, I have a few questions, but I can
ask as many.
I guess my first one, it might have been like related to the second final future research point that you mentioned. But did you notice what makes the small parcels of diverse native habitat, what makes those places different? Like, why are they, I guess, shielded or from these highly invasive plants? Like, why haven't they been influenced yet?
Well, actually, the smaller parcels of native habitat actually aren't as well shielded, because a lot of the surrounding agricultural landscape has a lot of these invasive species on it already, or they're nearby other waterfowl production areas that have these invasive species occurring in high frequencies. The areas that we're really seeing that are harboring the native species diversity and have a lot lower cover of these invasive species are the larger chunks of land that are still intact. So we have some, national wildlife refuges, WPAs, that are thousands of acres, tens of thousands of acres that have never been cultivated, anything like that. And when you look at some of the outskirts of those lands, they are starting to become invaded. But when you get further into those lands, the less invasion that you're seeing, because there's more of a barrier. There's a lot more problems with getting those species dispersed and colonizing into those larger parcels.
Yeah. I was also wondering about that map that you showed kind of in the beginning, where you showed the extent of the Prairie Pothole region. Is that the historical extent, or is that the current extent? Do you know if there's a difference?
Yeah, that's the present day extent. I mean, I'm sure it's shifted changed a little bit over time. And that was just a rough outline. Like, if you would have looked at where we did some of our study sites, some of them were actually outside of that rough outline, but they were still prairie potholes that we went to. For the most part, the barrier is at least to the west and to the south is the Missouri River here. That's where the prairie potholes kind of stop. But no, it's that whole area. That's the historic extent. It's still the present day extent, even though we've lost a lot of those wetlands. There's still some on the landscape all throughout that extent.
Cool, thank you. And then one last question I guess I have is, do you know what sort of management techniques are being used to control the invasive species and which ones would be the best?
Yeah, so like I mentioned early on, that's part of the reason why they're doing this, but they did already do it for the uplands, more of the native prairie areas especially. And that's that native prairie adaptive management program that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service employs. And it's hard to do too much of it because it includes fire, and North Dakota is a very anti-fire place. People are not just too jazzed about the idea of fire on the landscape. Still a lot of stuff going on here, a lot of trust issues and stuff before getting people to be a little bit more excited about putting fire on the landscape, but they still do it to some extent. And they've figured out essentially how it works is based on the cover of smooth brome and Kentucky bluegrass on the landscape. They do a certain timeline of management actions of rest, grazing, and fire that they have determined are the best at reducing the cover of those species on the landscape. So it might be like fire once every 3 years, grazing once every 2 years, and then make sure it's rested once every X amount of years. So something like that. And that's proven to help reduce things to some extent, but they're still perfecting it. It's still far from the best thing for the landscape, but they're working on it.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, no problem.
So I had questions, but David took one of my questions. So the other thing that I was kind of wondering, do you know if they're going to like study if it's has done any changes in the soil, like the invasive species, like nutrients or stuff like that?
Yeah. So they actually are. There's my advisor's actually been my grad school advisor. He's worked on some of that already. He's worked with a couple other professors at NDSU. I think they actually had a recent publication about it, but I know for sure they looked at it with Kentucky bluegrass. I think they were looking at it with some other species as well, and it's more of a greenhouse study looking at how Kentucky bluegrass changes more so the microbial communities that are in the soils. And I haven't actually read his paper yet, so I'm not certain of the results, but I know they do. That is one form of self-facilitization that they use. They change the soils, they change those soil microbe communities to help facilitate their growth, which often has negative consequences for the native species. So they're looking at it both for how they change it, but as well, they're looking at some native grasses to see if planting the native grasses in those soils afterwards can help change it back. So once they get the final results of that study, it'll be pretty interesting to look at, I think.
Okay. The other question I had was, have you guys considered like looking at like the insect community? Because like some of like the non-native plant species that you were talking about, like they have like that fluorescent flower. And I'm assuming like the native plant species really don't have that. So I'm wondering if that's something that you guys kind of considered, if that's like helping the spread of the invasive species.
I'm sure it is to some extent for some things like our Canada thistle. It's funny you mention it just because one of the endangered species, or I guess threatened species, that we work with here most in North Dakota is the Dakota skipper, and one of the plant species that it likes is Canada thistle. So there are complications with that as well. I guess I don't know of any research off the top of my head that's looked too much into how the insect species are contributing to that. I know for some invasive species, like a leafy spurge in our area, it's been shown that they are. But for the species I'm talking about today, I don't know if they really play as much of a role.
Okay. Yeah, those were my questions. Does anyone else have questions for Seth?
Yeah, I actually have a question. So I'm not a plant guy, so excuse me if this is silly. In the reseeded areas, how is the reseeding process? Like, what is it, like a hydroseeder, or are there people going out there and just kind of dumping seeds? How does that work?
I think it varies. I think I actually haven't done any of it myself, so I'm not extremely familiar with it, but I know one of the most common methods, because it's the cheapest method here, is just broadcast seeding. So they have a machine to do that. They go out there and it spreads the seeds. And I know at least more recently, they've been doing dormant seeding for that broadcast reseeding. So they get out there, like right before, right around the first snowfall of the year, and spread that seed across the landscape, because then it snows again soon after. That insulates it, that keeps it from blowing around too much, and actually helps it establish more successfully within the first year. I think that's how they do it for a lot of these, but seeing as I haven't actually went out and participated in the reseeding, I'm not too certain.
Okay. A follow-up to that, for the seed mixtures, is there a ratio from one species to another, or is it all pretty just evenly mixed?
Oh,
Like
do
like
you have anything else?
I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry, I was just saying to continue on.
Oh, I guess my sort of thought process behind this is, in a native community, there's going to be different, there's it's diverse, but for every species, there's like a different ratio of them that exist in that community, right? So let's say you've got like 25% of one species and then like 10% of another species or whatever in a natural native environment. I'm wondering if you were to put those seeds in some equal ratio in a seed mixture, if that'll potentially be less successful and less representative of what a natural system would look like.
Yeah. So I know they have specific seed mixtures that they use, and they're not all even. They'll have 50 species in there, and 3 of those species might make up 30 or 40% of the seed mixture. So they're not completely even, like you were saying. It's more of the other part of what you're saying. There's an uneven mix of the species in there. The one thing, so I think that's they found it to be the most successful. I think usually it's a higher percentage of grass species, and then a lower percentage of the seed mix is our native forbs, stuff like that. But usually I'm not sure exactly what the percentages are, and I'm not sure how they calculated that, but from the people I know who work with the National Wildlife Refuges and those WPAs, they have specific seeding mixes that they use depending on what region they're in and what the soil type is and stuff like that.
Okay. I guess what would your, sorry, I'm gonna hog this a little bit.
No worries.
What would your opinion be, if there's, going back to the seed mixtures, if there's different ratios of different species, and it's mixed into some sort of homogeneous mixture with varying percentages of different species, I'm wondering if, in your opinion, would that be reflective of a natural system in terms of, because I'm almost thinking that a natural system is more of like a complex mosaic of dispersal in some natural way, right? It's not just randomized, at least in my imagination of things. So I'm wondering if the reason why maybe you're seeing more invasives in a reseeded area, it's maybe because the native community can't be as strong if it's like evenly dispersed, as opposed to sort of like a patchwork, the way like a natural native system would be.
Yeah, no, I get what you're saying, and I completely agree with you there that that might be one of the potential reasons why invasive species, and that's why, you know, in one of my last points, I said it's pretty imperative that they get out and they monitor these areas after they acquire these lands and reseed them, because I don't think they're doing that to too much of an extent right now. Again, mostly because of lack of staff and resources. They just don't have the time, they don't have the funding and anything to get out and monitor all of these areas. But it would be something good to follow up on and check, because it definitely could be playing a role in why these invasive species are moving in. And you're right, you know, it's not supposed to be, you know, homogeneous across the landscape. It's supposed to be patchy, with certain areas having a lot higher percentage of certain species, other areas, you know, having a really mixed, diverse community. And especially if you go out and actually look at some of these landscapes right after they receive them, that's not what it's like at all. It's pretty homogeneous, like you were saying. So it would be good to look at something good for them to maybe consider in the future as well. Anything
anyone
else?
have questions for Seth? Okay, so if there's no more questions, thank you, Seth, for giving the talk on your research for your master's. It was very informative. I really enjoyed the talk. And thank you guys for attending. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Thanks for inviting me. I enjoyed it.
Yes. And then I'll definitely send you the link once I post up the recording.
Sounds good. I appreciate that.
Okay.